Good morning. Welcome to the Data-Driven Conference, and as you can see, that's going to be the hashtag for the event today. My name is Jay Hamilton, and as Director of the Stanford Journalism Program, I'm happy to welcome you to this event, which is co-sponsored by the REVS program at Stanford and the Center for Automotive Research at Stanford. As we start the day, what I'd like to do is just briefly focus on two questions that I think are going to arise throughout the panels. First is, what particular types of decisions are going to change with the new information that will be available from and about cars? And what types of stories that are important to society that may involve cars may go untold? Answering those questions involves technologists, journalists, academic researchers, and fortunately, that's who we have today in this room. So I'm very appreciative that you all are here, and this will be a very interactive conference. There's actually an economic theory behind this conference, and here's what it is. People have four different types of information demands: as consumers, as producers, things that are just entertaining to know, and as voters. And the first three types of information demands work pretty well, because if you don't seek out the information, you don't get the benefit. But that fourth type of information demand, the voter demand, that's subject to something called rational ignorance. Because you have such a small probability of having an impact on public affairs or public policy issues, it may not pay for you in an investment motive to pay attention to public policy issues. And so if you look across time, there's been an underinvestment in public policy stories. So what does that have to do with cars? If you think back, say 20 years ago, there were things called thriving Metro daily newspapers. And they often bundled those four information demands. You had car sections, which brought car advertising. You had coverage of cars as a business. You have people in this room who worked on cars as satisfying an entertainment demand for information, and you even had investigative reports about cars. If you fast forward to today, that bundle has been broken. And if you think about where people get information demands as consumers or producers about cars, where they get information about the route that they're going to take, what traffic is like, that's going to come to them from a company that primarily is not a media company, that isn't thinking about particular public policy issues. So the good news about information demands is that if you're a consumer or a producer, you get better data, you get quicker data. The bad news is that the people who collect information now about location of cars, operation of cars, they're going to be focused on those consumer or producer demands, maybe not so much about those public affairs stories. Good news, though, is that if you think about telling public affairs stories, cars as sensors, cars as data, offer a way to lower the cost of discovering stories. That's an emphasis at the Stanford Journalism Program, where we're working in a field called computational journalism. And if you think about how cars can operate as sensors, we have examples of journalists who've done that in this room. If you think about the Sun Sentinel, they use public access laws to get transponder data from police cars, and they earned a Pulitzer Prize for a series that showed speeding police officers. If you think about the Chicago Tribune, they took information from a website called clearstreets.org, which was made visible by the city of Chicago, and that gave you, in real time, the location of snowplows in Chicago. And what did that reveal? It revealed that the city's longest serving city council member got snow shovel services on his street early and often, which is also voting, I guess, in Chicago. But if you think about what that means, is that there is data about cars that's floating out there, public records, or from open government, or you can create your own data. Rob Jackson, who's a professor at Stanford, hooked up a methane detector to a series of cars in the District of Columbia and had them driven all around the district and found 6,000 natural gas leaks from the aging pipe systems there. So literally you can use cars as sensors. We can also look at the data about car location, and those types of stories are being used now in creative ways. One is, well, if you look at car fines, people in this room have showed how in some localities, including Ferguson, car fines can be a significant source of revenue, and it can be a way to in effect, tax people. If you look at how car data, specifically license plate data, is used in the war on terror and the war on drugs, you have stories that involve potential violations of privacy. And if you look at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration data, you have journalists in this room have written about how the government may not be optimally using data as a way to spot problems with products or pressure folks to deal with potential problems with their products. So on the good news side, we've got great consumer and producer stories. The bad news is we don't have a revenue model to tell those public policy stories. The good news is cars can be used as data as a way to lower the cost of discovering stories. One final point is to think about what will the journalism of autonomous cars look like. If you go back to, say, the 1920s, journalists had to figure out a way to write about cars. And the Chicago Tribune in the 1920s published a daily clock of death, which sounds like something from Comedy Central, but it was real. And what that daily clock of death showed was number of fatalities that year from autos, from moonshine, and from guns. And if you looked at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, what they did is they started to write articles about car crashes, and at the top of each article, they wrote the number of deaths in the city from car crashes that year. And if you looked at the Indianapolis News, what they did is they did special investigations on dangerous corners. So what we're going to see with autonomous cars is eventually there are going to be probably some serious accidents that arise from autonomous vehicles. And then the question for journalists is, how will they cover that? Behavioral economics would indicate that they might overestimate the severity of low probability events, that they might overestimate the dangers. So an interesting thing for journalists now is to think about what baseline will you compare in terms of types of accidents once autonomous cars start to have their own accidents. So in summary today, what we're going to do is focus on a couple of questions that technologists and journalists can help us with. Number one, what types of decisions, particularly as consumers or producers, will be affected as we get better data from cars? And number two, how can we use cars as sensors of how institutions operate? It's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Ingrassia, who's going to be moderating the first panel. And Paul is the managing editor at Reuters and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for his coverage of the auto industry. Paul.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm really very honored to be here and to moderate this panel, which is about, I think, a fascinating topic. In Jay's very kind introduction, he mentioned the Pulitzer that came my way 20-some years ago, and I just want to tell you that my most vivid and fondest memory from that was when one of my sons, who was then in junior high school at the Jesuit Academy in Detroit, went to school the next day, and he told his teacher that his dad had just won the Pulitzer surprise. Okay, I think he had it about right. Anyway, I'm really the great thing about this panel, if I can, before I introduce our panel members, I'd like to sort of frame the topic. And the great thing about this panel, I think, is that it really lends itself to a continuity of the incredible revolutionary impact that the automobile has had on American life that's been going on for more than a century. When you think about it, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Model T Ford really was the first people's car in the world, and it was actually, it wasn't the cheapest car, by the way, that was sold in the early years of the 20th century. That was a car called the Brush Runabout. And the Brush Runabout had, it was cheaper than the Model T for various reasons, had a smaller engine, but it also had wooden axles and wheels. So the quip of the day was wooden axles, wooden wheels, wooden run, okay? But the Model T had a profound impact on American life because it really freed Americans from rural peasantry. Suddenly you could get from point A to point B, and once people saw the bright lights of the city, really nothing in America was the same ever again. Fast forward to the middle of the century, as the car became more ubiquitous, and I think the second most influential car in American history in terms of affecting how we live and think and how we act, what American culture, was really a very ill-fated car. It was the Chevrolet Corvair. Now, for those of you who might remember the Corvair, it's the vehicle that made Ralph Nader famous. He wrote a book about it called Unsafe at Any Speed. And the Corvair really had an enormous impact on American life when you think about it. For one thing, it really changed the entire attitude of the United States government and the federal government toward regulating industries, and not just the car industry, but the level of federal regulation of virtually every industry dramatically increased in those years after the mid-1960s when the Corvair scandal broke. Ralph Nader published his book in 1965. That was 5 years after the Corvair was introduced. The Corvair also really was instrumental in spawning one of the two great growth industries of late 20th century America. Now, obviously, one of those growth industries was started right in the environs of the Stanford campus, and that is the internet technology. But the other growth industry, frankly, was lawsuits. And the Corvair really was the vehicle and the product that really was fathered, in a sense, the whole product liability lawsuit industry, which is such a part of the fabric of our life today, for better or worse. And then one of the more ironic impacts of the Chevy Corvair was General Motors finally discontinued the car in 1969. 31 years later, in the presidential election of the year 2000, the Corvair, the long-dead Corvair, had an actual dramatic impact on that election. Now, how did that happen? You might remember this was the election of the Bush-Gore hanging chads that was decided in the state of Florida. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in the end, awarded George W. Bush the victory in the state of Florida by less than 2,000 votes. But guess what? There was a third-party candidate on the ballot in Florida that year, and that was Ralph Nader. And he got about 95,000 votes. I think it's safe to assume that many of those votes, most of those votes, would have gone to Al Gore instead of George W. Bush. So you can see the huge impact that this car has had on American life and thought over a period of really many decades. So where are we now? Well, we're on the verge of another set of revolutions, if you will. I think the fascinating thing about the auto industry is there are three simultaneous revolutions going on underway. And that is, first of all, the propulsion revolution. What is going to replace, if anything, the internal combustion engine? Will it be electrics? Will it be gas-electric hybrids? Will it be hydrogen fuel cells, et cetera, et cetera? The second revolution is the connectivity revolution. And the third revolution is really the ultimate impact, if you will, or the ultimate meaning of the connectivity revolution, which would be the autonomous driverless car. And this conference and this panel in particular will be concerned not about the propulsion revolution, but about the connectivity revolution and how and when that might lead to autonomy. As the internet really revolutionized American life at the end of the 20th century, now you have basically automobiles and the internet coming together at the beginning of the 21st century in a way I don't think people really expected just a couple decades ago. And I don't think that the impact of this is fully appreciated as we speak today. So I'm really honored to introduce our three panelists. We have a very distinguished panel here. First, we have Jim Buczkowski, who is a Ford Motor Company. And I spent a couple hours yesterday at Ford's new office about a half a mile from here, and some of the things they're working on are really fantastic. Jim is a Henry Ford Technical Fellow and Director of Electrical and Electronic Systems Research and Innovation at Ford. He's responsible for the research and design of electrical and electronic systems, including in-car information and entertainment, telematics, driver information, and active safety systems for Ford, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And Jim has been with Ford for 35 years. He's based in Dearborn, but I think he takes the Dearborn shuttle out to San Francisco quite regularly. Our second panelist is Liz Slocum Jensen, who is the CEO and co-founder of Road Rules, which is a tech startup. It's automating tasks that are done while driving. She speaks and she writes about the connected car industry. She's an expert in connected car APIs. She spent the first 15 years of her career in the enterprise technology sector, focusing on customer engagement and strategic operations at Informatica, Ironport, and Cisco. And she has an MBA from a university somewhere east of here called Duke. And finally, we have a journalist, and a journalist who really has made his mark in writing about a lot of the issues that arise from the connected car, and that is Aaron Kessler from the New York Times. He's based in the Washington Bureau of the Times, and he writes a lot about auto industry and related safety regulation and technology. He's a longtime practitioner of using data analysis to uncover stories, and of late he's been covering the fallout on Capitol Hill from the massive recalls by Takata, a Japanese company that's made many defective airbags, millions of defective airbags that have been deployed in cars around the world, and also the ignition switch scandal at General Motors. And he recently spent a year at the Columbia Business School as a Knight Bagehot Fellow. I don't know if any of you happened to see Aaron's article from the New York Times on Monday, but he did a major story, and the headline says, "Report sees weak security in cars' wireless systems." And basically, the point of this study that Aaron wrote about is that all the information that is gathered electronically by vehicles isn't terribly secure, at least in the conclusion of this particular study, and therefore it's vulnerable to hackers and other sorts of things. So I think we have people who are really going to come from this broad topic in really three different and distinct ways. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Jim Buczkowski, Ford Motor Company. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, let me bring up a slide. Thank you very much. It really is an honor to be here. This is an industry that's really changing a lot. My 35 years has all been really electronics technology related, and it continues to accelerate. These are really exciting times. It was great to have Paul come by our office yesterday and see some of the great things and exciting things we're working on, but a lot of disruption going on. And what I'd like to do today is really talk a little bit about the fact that data has always been and continues to be a big part of how we design, build, and operate vehicles. And I just want to start a little bit with a bit of background, because we've been dealing with a lot of big data. Maybe not as effectively because we haven't had the tools, but the amount of data we generate in our industry is tremendous, and we'll give you a couple samples of that. Connectivity. Connectivity represents an inflection point as well, too. As vehicles get connected, it's going to change the amount of data we have access to, and allows us to help consumers with new experiences, whether they're maintenance related, whether they're convenience related. Again, when vehicles get connected, it's another inflection point, and we'll talk just a little bit about that, just to give you a flavor of things going on. And then on top of that, on top of those changes, the dynamics of the environment we're in are changing pretty dramatically as well, too. The urbanization and the challenges of megacities and so on. And I think those of you that are familiar with the keynote speech that our CEO, Mark Fields, did at CES, we're focused on smart mobility, looking at the future. It's not just about, we can't look at anymore just the product itself. We've got to look at how the product really fits in the environment. And those changes that we're talking about are going to contribute to how we make decisions on products and the services that are needed to support those products. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So let me move forward quickly here. So beginning with product development, this is just to give you some background, and some of these figures we think are pretty impressive. Impressive in terms of how much data we have to manage. And again, I'm just taking one example of our process of bringing cars to market. Of course, we've got manufacturing, marketing, and sales that are all generating data. This is just the CAD side of the business. 50 vehicles and 20 engine, 20 powertrain programs we manage simultaneously. Right now, there's 70 different programs that are being managed. You can see the bulk CAD data, 500 terabytes. Number of Oracle database records, 30 billion. Consume 4 terabytes of new disk space weekly. Bill of materials, we're managing 32,000 active parts in our bill of material at any time. And as products go through to production, all these simultaneous products are hitting at different times. We're managing about 163,000 design changes to support those products. So we're already dealing with huge amount of data. And remember, I'm just talking here about the product development part of the process as well, too. If you include manufacturing and marketing and sales and so on, it really grows. So we have no shortage of data. We have no shortage of data to operate on, although we probably haven't had the tools to be able to effectively use it. And now with some of the big data analytics tools, there's huge opportunity to really harvest that data, help us make better decisions. On the vehicle side, and I don't expect you to read the diagram up there, but this is what a typical electrical architecture looks like in a vehicle. And so the left-hand side box on the screen there represents that little connector that's down below the dash, the OBD2, what we call the OBD2 connector, and that's the gateway that interconnects all the different modules and so on. And the other boxes represent all the different electronic controllers across the vehicle. This represents a max complexity case. It depends what the customer orders and so on, but you can see the complexity of the electronic systems on the vehicles. And with that, we're generating approximately 6,000 signals, and these are just the signals that are communicating between the electronic modules on the vehicle. It's not the signals inside. It's probably another 10x or so if you started to include the signals inside a module that are communicating. 500,000 kilobits created per second. And then, as I mentioned, if you include the signals inside each individual module, it's really a massive amount of data. So this is just what's inside the vehicle with all these controllers controlling brakes, controlling powertrain, the infotainment system, and so on. So again, the opportunity to operate on that data to create better experiences for customers is massive. And you can see 132 million if you look across those modules, and this is an example for an F-150, 132 million lines of software, 650 megabytes of memory. It doesn't seem like a whole lot, but when you look at control systems, that's a lot of memory, processed with 21 different CPUs across an average F-150 vehicle. Now turning to the first change we'll talk about, and that is connecting vehicles, connecting now all that data that resides in the vehicle, how now we have access to it outside of the vehicle through connectivity, through embedded modems, through the smartphone, and so on. Gartner estimates by 2020 250 million connected vehicles will be enabled and on the road. And when you think about what does that mean, now that data that was locked inside the vehicle now is you can access it externally. Right, and we can operate with it. We can create better experiences by accessing that data, and they can be experiences along the drive. They can be experiences on service. So there's a huge opportunity with us. And so some examples. This is an example of today versus what we're looking at in the near-term future. And I'm just picking one particular system in the vehicle, a brake system. So today, we get vehicle health reports from vehicles, average about 300 bytes of data per vehicle per year. You can multiply that times the number of vehicles we produce and so on. So it's a fair amount of data, but it's a very small amount. As we look at real-time monitoring of things like brakes, we could potentially, just the brakes alone, have 11 gigabytes of data per vehicle per year, just from the brake system if we chose to gather every piece of data. All right, so there's a huge opportunity, a huge access to information and data. We've got to figure out exactly how much of that we really want to transfer out of the vehicle, but the brake system is generating or creating that data, and that's a huge opportunity for us to help customers. We design vehicles for the average customer for the worst case conditions and so on. Some customers are harder on their vehicles, and this kind of data might help them better understand the service they may need more often. Other customers, because they're light duty and so on, they may have their service interval on brakes may go a bit longer. So this data can really help us, so it provides real potential. And again, here I'm just talking about the brake system. If you add the powertrain control system and other systems on the vehicle, just a tremendous amount of data that we have access to now with a connected vehicle on the road. But it's really more than those kinds of changes. You know, I could go through various examples on connectivity and connected cars and the data we can generate and various experiences that we can create. But it's more, what's happening today is more than just the change in the vehicle and connectivity. It's the whole environment. And when you look at what's happening, I mentioned in the opening about the environment the mobility environment that we're working in today, urbanization and worries about security and the mega cities and so on. When we think about mobility and transportation in the future, we can't just think about the car itself and even the data the car generates. We got to think about the environment that we're going to be putting these vehicles in the future, and how do we solve some of the bigger problems, not just the mobility of how to get a person from point A to point B, but how it's going to affect the environment, how it's going to affect parking in cities and so on. So we're on a journey really to really address this future of smart mobility. And our strategy, and again, repeating a bit from the CES keynote remarks, is under the umbrella of what we call Ford Smart Mobility. And it really is dealing with data. Data is the underlying opportunity, harvesting and using that data to provide a better overall customer experience, whether it's the buy or research buy ownership experience, or you know, just navigation and the experience you have in the car as you're going from point A to point B. Connectivity is a big portion of that. What data we transfer back and forth to create those kinds of experiences, and it also leads to automated driving, and how is that going to impact cars in the future, and how we integrate cars into the environment, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-infrastructure communication, and so on. So data analytics is really key, and data is really driving how we design our future, not only just the products, but also the products and services that Ford will deliver. Some examples, just to show you the tremendous opportunity with data. This is some work that was done on one of our experiments in the Dearborn, or really the Detroit area. And so you can see here we instrumented 250 vehicles through an OBD2 connector port that transmitted data back. These are employees of Ford. 80,000 trips tracked, 33,000 hours of driving, 80 billion messages collected, 11 terabytes of data. The data explodes dramatically, right? But the tools we have today, the analytics tools we have today, help us really harvest that data and help us make some great decisions about it to help in terms of traffic and congestion, understanding how people are using their vehicles. So these kinds of experiments, excuse me, are helping us shape our smart mobility plan going forward. The kinds of vehicles, how those vehicles interface with the environment and other forms of transportation like trains and bicycles and other forms of transportation as well too. Understanding this kind of information helps us understand behavior, driving behaviors. You know, how are people using their vehicles, percentage of time on short trips, shopping trips, and so on. So we're able to categorize and understand the kinds of trips they're making, how effective they are, and then compare different results. Again, looking for a bigger solution, not just what the right car is, but how the right car in the right environment makes for the best experience for consumers. So again, data really is important and is really helping us do that. Parking. You know, there are a lot of studies that talk about the congestion that's created just by people looking for parking in big cities today. And so data, extracting information from the vehicles, anonymizing it, but extracting the information so that we can see the various patterns on parking. Building solutions that are integrated with the vehicle that help people not just get from point A to point B, but point A to the parking space, right, to avoid the congestion that's created as people are, you know, looking for and searching for a space. And so again, collecting this data, analyzing this data is helping us frame what our Ford Smart Mobility future will be. Now, the other interesting thing about this is driving, this data, this new way of looking at things is driving across our traditional corporate organizations, right? Product development, IT, marketing and sales, must all work together. And at Ford, we talk a lot about our One Ford plan and working together being so important. You know, this is driving into a space that traditionally we haven't had to work with. We haven't had to work ever so closely with the IT organization. They haven't been as product focused as enterprise focused. But today, now product development and IT have to work very closely to create these kinds of solutions to be successful, as well as our marketing and sales organizations and so on. So this is a very new space that's really important for us to be. If we're going to create great solutions, we got to be very effective at working across these traditional boundaries. Now, Ford Smart Mobility, a little bit more in that, is really focusing on connectivity, sensor technologies, pervasive data. Those are what are bringing the information to us. Connectivity, obviously, is key. We're also leveraging with our experiments, crowdsourcing ideas and so on from the public. We're using some of our tools like OpenXC to help people create and invent and innovate on their own so that we can learn from that. Sensor technology, obviously very critical to autonomous driving, but that sensor technology can also be used for things like finding parking spaces. Today we're doing some experiments where using the existing sensors on vehicles, as vehicles drive through parking lots, we can locate open parking spaces and crowdsource that data together and aggregate it and fan it back out to customers so that, again, they can find parking spaces more easily. And again, that's using existing data on vehicles from existing sensors, but through connectivity and through analytics tools, being able to analyze it and provide good value going back to customers. And again, pervasive data, drawing from outside the vehicle, right? Information that's available, you know, in the infrastructure and so on, and combining that with data in the vehicle to create new value for customers as well. So these are the enablers, some of the enablers that are really driving and helping us build our smart mobility strategy going forward. Connectivity, again, across the enterprise is important. So when we talk about connectivity today and connecting the car, it's not a product development, a product challenge overall or opportunity. It's an opportunity for our service folks. As you drive into the dealership, connectivity make a better experience for the customer as they approach the dealership. Data science and data science management is something that we've had in small amounts, but today it really is a growing importance, and growing that competency internally, acquiring that competency to analyze this data and provide great solutions and value to customers is really critical, and we're investing in that. Innovative culture, driving an innovative culture, as Paul mentioned, our Palo Alto Research Center that we made a big commitment to last year to grow, and will grow to about 125 target by the end of this year, to integrate into this culture here in Silicon Valley and drive faster, quicker innovation back into Ford is key to us. And then design thinking. Where many of us, where I come from, I know there are journalists in the room and so on, but there are technologists as well too. You know, it's really about the experience. Technology is an enabler for great experiences. Technology can deliver value, but value is what's important, and value that you know, customers seek through the experiences they have. And so we do have to remember how we design, and we design for experiences, not for technology and technology's sake. In conclusion, data is driving how we think about smart mobility, and again, you know, we're thinking much more broadly. We're not just thinking about creating great products. It is. We still plan to create great products, but it's a wider thinking of how those products fit into the environment. Connectivity, sensor technology, and pervasive data is driving that new thinking and driving how we're going to create those solutions going forward. Data is driving innovation. Being able to connect different sources of data is creating new value for customers, and so you know, again, innovation through data and analytics of the data. Urbanization, you know, the environment that we're putting these cars in is really critical as well too, and so as we design, it's important to understand how these are going to fit in the environment, and the experiments that we're doing, the 25 experiments around the world, are to help us understand better how to build smart mobility solutions for consumers going forward. And of course, data and connectivity, again, are then key to smart mobility. And as the box on the bottom says, really, we're looking for a smarter, more connected mobility landscape that'll encourage efficiency, increase safety, reduce traffic congestion, and contribute to environmental improvement, as well as shape personal mobility in a more effective way for millions of people. So really, you know, it's expanding the way we look at product development, product design, and our business, because it's more about mobility than it is just about the product itself. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to Liz. Thank you.
Great, that works. Hi, I'm Liz, and I'm here to talk about connected car APIs, what the data points are, and how the car connects. A little bit about me. I'm the CEO and founder of Road Rules, and what we're doing is we're using the sensors off the smartphone to automate tasks while you drive. I got started in connected cars about 2 years ago, and I was doing weekend hackathons with friends, and one of my friends had a Tesla, and we'd create projects off of that, so I thought that was a lot of fun. And I started doing research on what kind of data points were available for the car and how the car connects. So I'm here to share that research with you, and I'll be presenting this from the point of view of a third-party app developer. So let's talk about how the car connects to the internet. There are 3 basic ways that the car connects. There is the embedded modem in the car, there's connectivity that is tethered from a mobile phone, or there is an aftermarket device that you plug into the steering column, and that has a modem embedded in it. And then there are 3 integration points where you would build an app to integrate with the car data. And that would be an API in the cloud through a mobile phone software development kit, or in the head unit, which is also called the infotainment system. So let's talk about how the big car makers do this. And this is an embedded modem in the car. Connectivity happens directly from the car up into the cloud. And your app will live on the phone or in the cloud and connect to the API in the cloud. So this is how Tesla, GM OnStar, Nissan, and Hyundai Blue Link do it. This is an embedded modem when you have an API for the infotainment system. The API and your app lives on the car, and your app may or may not talk up to the cloud. And this is how GM had their infotainment API up until about 6 months ago, and they're actually moving away to, they announced that they are moving towards an Android Auto and Apple CarPlay strategy. So this is how those systems work. This is when it's tethered through the phone, and there is a mobile SDK that lives on the phone. So the SDK lives on the phone, the app lives on the phone, and you might connect up to the cloud if your app needs it. So to put that into more practical terms, if you want to listen to music and you download your songs directly to the phone, the connectivity is just going to happen between the car and the phone via Bluetooth. But if you want to stream music, say through Pandora or Spotify, you would actually, that's the dotted line up to the top where it's connecting to the web app there. One thing I do want to point out with this slide is that because the SDK lives on the phone, you're not getting quite as much data about the car as you would with the other models. This is the aftermarket, and let me give you a little bit of background. It sounds like a lot of people are here are familiar with the auto industry, but since 1996, all cars sold in the US have required for there to be a diagnostics port called OBD2. And what that has been used for was so that car mechanics and smog check providers could connect into the car's computer and download information. So lately, what tech companies are doing is they've created an aftermarket device that you buy and you plug into the steering column into this port. And there are 2 ways that the car connects to the internet this way. In the pink box here with the pink line is there's an embedded modem directly in that device, and that connects up to the cloud. Whereas with Dash and Automatic, they tether through the phone. And so there's a Bluetooth connection up to the phone, and then also if you have your car needs to connect to the cloud, it can do that as well. And all connectivity and integration happens to the API in the cloud. So let's talk about what data points are available. This is a general overview of vehicle status. And the general rule of thumb is that if you can look at your dashboard and see that information, you can probably get that through the API. And what you'll see here is that the automakers have a lot of things that they haven't released to the aftermarket. But where the aftermarket is offering value is in events. So they can do things such as detecting whether there was an accident or whether your car has been towed. And so that's where they're doing that through sensor fusion by taking a couple different data points and creating that event. So I think that's really valuable. These are commands that are available, and this is what changes the status of the car. You can unlock the door, start the car remotely. And as you can see, the automakers haven't released that to the aftermarket. This could change in the future. We'll see. So let's say that I got you really excited about starting your, developing your first connected car app, and you want to know where to get started. So you start in the green box here, and these are published APIs that have developer community support that's public. The yellow box here has research platforms, and that's for Ford OpenXC, Toyota, and BMW. And OpenXC has a GitHub repository that you can connect to now, whereas Toyota and BMW release their APIs for hackathons. And in the red box are APIs that are not publicly available. And what that means is that there isn't a publicly supported community, and they haven't published these APIs. This doesn't necessarily mean that you can't access this data. So for example, with Tesla, a couple weeks after the Model S was released, someone reverse engineered the APIs, and so people have been tinkering around on that platform and making apps. Let's talk about, so who's using these apps? It's, I have a small sample here of the number of apps per platform, and this is what's publicly available in terms of the numbers. And as you can see, there aren't that many apps. In fact, there's actually a lot of overlap with the types of apps that are available. You'll see Spotify and Pandora on a lot of these and MLB baseball information. So what I want to point out here is that there hasn't been that much movement in the Ford and GM numbers in the past year or so. And it's, what GM has announced is that, like I said before, is that they're moving towards an Apple Android strategy. And what I kind of fear is that access is starting to close a little bit to this data that's coming directly from the car. So this brings me to my wish list. And these are things that I want to see for the connected car industry going forward. I'd like to see more access to data. When you keep the API open, it allows more room for innovation. So streaming music is great, but I really love the idea that the car is the sensor. And so to add another use case, I love the idea of the car as a mobile weather app. You could take information about whether the wipers are on, ambient temperature, ambient light, and you could put that with location, and then you could find out what microclimates are going on based on a network of cars. So I really love that idea. The next thing that's unresolved is who's going to pay for this data bandwidth. And Tesla pays for their connectivity, but for example, with GM, they think they want the consumers to pay for it. So last year, GM announced a data plan for the car, and the baseline plan was $10 for 200 megabytes. And what Jim was talking about is how even the brakes alone can create 11 terabytes of data per year. And I put it in more practical terms for the consumer that if you're streaming music for 2 hours, you've already gone over your cap. So what I'm hoping is that car makers and telecom companies find value in connectivity to the car and help subsidize that data, those data plans. And finally, what I'm hoping is that everyone who works in this sector is transparent and responsible about how they use their data. I hope that if my feeling is that as a company, if you explain to the customer how you're going to use that data to add value back to them, you'll create this relationship of trust. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, you can email me. I have this slide deck on my Twitter feed at @WhatLizTweets. And then finally, if you want to sign up for the Road Rules beta, you can do that at roadrules.co.
Thanks, Liz. We're also going to have time for verbal questions too afterwards. So with that, Aaron, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thank you very much. I don't have a slideshow, so I guess I'll sit. You can tell me the journalist is here. I've got notes on my notepad. But no, that was fascinating, Liz. Thank you. It's incredible, at least to me, having covered this for at least some period of time. It's hard to understate the extent of the revolution that's taking place, as Paul indicated. I mean, cars used to be the equivalent of kind of an air-gapped computer. I mean, they had all this stuff, but it was never connected to anything. And now that's completely changing. I mean, with the advent of GM, for example, has started to turn its cars into wireless hotspots, but now really with phones being brought into the car and tethered to the vehicles, all of that stuff that's been pent up inside the car is now going to be flying out into the world. And so the question is, what do you do about it? So I had the pleasure of actually going down to Google not too long ago and looking at their Android Auto. What's on the horizon there? I'll talk about that in a second, but just briefly, because we are going to be dealing with some safety issues, thought I might start a little bit with that, talk about some of the data that's available in the space of auto safety. One of my colleagues is, Danielle is in the back of the room. She's going to get more into that later on this afternoon, but just to give you a sense of maybe some of the things that are available now and where it could go. So for example, as a journalist, you have access to certain database, the public does. The best in terms of detail, something called FARS, which is the Federal Accident Reporting System, I believe. But it's basically for only deaths that occur in auto accidents. And you get some pretty rich, detailed information out of that. But those come essentially from police reports. I mean, you go down to the end of the day and you're talking about an accident where certain information is captured at the scene, certain information is captured afterwards. Maybe they get the black box that's in many of the cars and they download that. And as a result, you get this sort of combination and that feeds up through the system and you get some pretty detailed results. But that's 50,000 accidents a year. When you go beyond that, you have something called early warning reports, EWRs, which are really a joke because they don't tell you anything that's useful. In fact, Honda, thankfully not Ford here, but recently there are a few automakers that got in trouble for never filing these things to begin with, and they got penalized. But really, they don't tell you much at all. You get a data set from that, and it'll say something like the problem will be listed as engine or chassis, and that's it. I mean, you have no idea what that's supposed to refer to, nor does the government. And it's up to them, the NHTSA, to go back to a Ford or a GM and say, hey, can you explain that a little more? But they rarely do that. And so there's some efforts afoot, at least where I'm in DC, to require automakers to maybe provide some more information. But right now, that database is basically useless. The other big source is consumer complaints. So these are individual drivers out there in the world, and they have a problem with their cars, so they file a complaint with the government. They say, hey, my ignition switch didn't work, my brakes failed, my wipers, and that comes in, and there's a certain amount of detail to that, but just because it's being submitted by regular people all over the country, it's difficult to work with. The government itself really has some difficulty analyzing its own data. As we've seen in the last year, and Danielle was certainly involved with this, but when it came to really getting to the bottom of the GM scandal, that was really journalists out there digging through the data that NHTSA, the government, had the whole time, just didn't know how to look at right. You go back to the Toyota unintended acceleration, it was some folks down at the LA Times, I believe, that were responsible for really breaking that open. Again, looking at the data that was out there and just finding a way to analyze it in a way that made sense. Even back to Ford Firestone tires, remember those tires that would explode in the rollovers? That was another case where the government sort of had trouble analyzing its own information. So the data that comes in is not great. But when you think about the future of a connected car, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities. Some of them are a little spooky, right? But you think about everything that we were just talking about, terabytes of data that are gathered. The car is producing all of this stuff, diagnostics, speed, if there's an accident, everything is captured essentially in the car, but up until now it's been stuck in the car. And the only time anybody goes and tries to get it out of there is if there's a fatality and they pull out the black box, and even the so-called black box. And even some of the black boxes are not even available for the police to read. I mean, during the Toyota scandal, there was a whole issue where Toyota had to send its people out to the accident scene to use its proprietary way of pulling down the data. So, but as we move in that direction, we could see a day where a lot of this crash data could automatically be captured, either by, again, police at the scene that pull out a USB stick and pull it down, or more likely, as cars become connected to the cloud, you have just an automatic upload of very rich information on every crash, say, in the United States. So if you can imagine that, we go from having detailed information on 50,000 crashes to everything. Now that, I mean, as someone who comes from New Jersey, there's sort of implications to that. What if you don't want to call the cops, or insurance company is going to get access to this, or car company is going to have access to this, and to what extent? But the idea of having direct access to all of this data has some pretty enormous implications for the way safety is both studied and the way it's implemented across the auto industry. Because right now we just don't know about that. Most of the accidents that happen in the country, no one really knows for sure what happened. You really have a police report, if you have anything. To be able to capture consistently detailed, rich data that's available to the public, to journalists, to researchers, to the auto companies themselves, it really could be a game changer, at least as far as some of us that work in this space are concerned. Of course, the flip side of that, as Paul alluded to, is you have security concerns. If all of this stuff is suddenly going to be transmitted out there into the world, what guarantees as a driver do I have that it's going to be used properly, that it's not going to be stolen, that it's not going to be misappropriated in some way? And so last week, I wrote about it and others did too. There was a congressional study that came out that basically found that most of the automakers don't do a great job at securing their data. And in certain ways, that's not surprising because they're just getting into that field. I mean, if you think about every time you have a computer, right? People see laptops here in the room, and every time you need to update that software, you have to take the laptop over to the computer store and have them do it. That's basically what cars have been like now. Even software updates for the car, recalls, you physically take it to the dealer. It gets updated, and then you take the car home. I mean, now you're going to just start to have those things streamed over. So the auto industry is sort of waking up to the idea of what this means to have a fully network-connected car. But at least the congressional study that was released last week said they've got a long way to go. Not only do they not know, the majority of them, how vulnerable their systems are to attack, but even more troubling, it's hard for them to know when they even have been hacked. So you think about something like the Target data breach or some of these things, where these things went on for months, and nobody realized right away that there was an issue. So that's going to be, again, something the industry is going to have to reckon with, is how do they even figure out there's a problem, deal with it in real time, hopefully stop it before it becomes an issue. And then the other part of that is what's going to be collected about you, your driving habits, your vehicle, who's going to get it, what are the rules going to be? Right now, there really are no rules. The auto industry groups have a set of voluntary principles they came out with at the end of last year that talked about not selling this data to marketers, not using it unless you have an express business purpose. But really, it's kind of the Wild West now. I mean, there's no hard and fast rules for, if we're talking about everything that both of the other two panelists here have mentioned, everywhere you've been, everywhere you parked, what your speed has been at all times, anything that goes into the car, what your braking habits are, to use your turn signal when you get off the highway. I mean, someone's going to have all of that, and it's a question of how long should they keep it, and who should they share it with? Should they share it with marketers? Should they share it with law enforcement? I mean, we're here in California, and if there are any colleagues in the room that work in local TV in Southern California, I mean, every other day, right, you've got a car chase on the road. We could be seeing a day fairly soon where those no longer happen, where the law enforcement, an officer can call up a company like Ford and say, I'm following this Mustang, we're chasing it down the road, can you please disable it? And they can do that. Or if they can't, they will be able to do it fairly soon. And so the question is, well, should that go through Ford, or should the government itself, should the police officer in his car have the ability to stop your car, to basically disable it at any moment? That's something that's still being sorted out. At this point, no one really knows. It's already happening to a certain extent with cars that are purchased, particularly used cars that are bought with high interest loans and subprime loans, where the dealers will shut off that car if you don't pay your bill on time. It'll just stop. And they say, well, we try not to do that if you're on the road, which is great because that would be a problem, but they can basically do it at any time. They can press a button and kill your car at any moment. So how all that's going to sort itself out is kind of one of those interesting areas that's really yet to be sorted out. So in terms of the infotainment aspect of this and the data that's streaming through for your own enjoyment, it's going to be harder and harder to separate your music list from the diagnostics of your car, and whether those two things are going to be dealt with separately in terms of how the rules come down, how our society decides to deal with them is again yet to be determined. I think that's going to be figured out in the next few years. But right now you've got companies like Ford, GM, really everybody that's trying to, at a lightning pace, as fast as they can, connect your car to the web. Because you can think about all the implications and the benefits that you would get from that. You could have, again, we talked about you have to take your car in for service. Well, okay, if you've got a software update, which happens quite a lot, where there's sort of a software problem, electronic glitch in the car, it needs to be fixed. You've got to go into the dealer, you've got to schedule a time. Not that long from now, they'll just download that like you do for your computer or your smartphone, and it'll update, it'll be done. For more troubling or problematic safety concerns, there's a lot of cars now, trucks, where you get a little alert if your tire pressure is low or if your engine has an issue. So we're probably not that long from the time where you could go ahead, you're driving down the road, you get an alert in your car that says, hey, you've got a problem with your pistons, you're going to have a breakdown in the next 3 weeks if you don't do something about it. By the way, here's some local dealerships nearby or service stations. Would you like me to make an appointment? Say yes. And then you say yes, and then it's done. It says, thank you, bring your car over at 2 o'clock. Everything else around you that's now connected through your smartphone will really be connected through your car. There was a debate at some point in recent years about whether smartphones should be used in cars. And one side said no. They introduced software to block signals or to basically limit you from using your smartphone in a car because there's a lot of distraction trouble that goes with that, as you might imagine. The other side said, well, no, people are going to want to bring their smartphones into the car. We need to integrate them in a better way. That side has clearly won. I don't think there's anybody in the industry now that says, yeah, we're going to go with trying to block users from using their phones. The question is, can they be used safely? And so what's starting to happen is the recognition that, okay, people are going to bring these things into the car no matter what. And texting while driving is a huge problem. Checking your Facebook statuses, even looking for directions. I mean, driving around here, I came out here with my wife, so I was able to hold the little phone up and tell her where to go and whatnot, and while she drove. But if I was in that car by myself, if I don't have voice, turn-by-turn directions, just looking down at a map and looking back up, you're talking about some significant time when your eyes are away from the road. And so what the automakers seem to be coalescing around is this idea of these shared platforms that are designed to make it easier to drive and operate things through the internet at the same time. And that's obviously what startups are doing, like yours, and automakers themselves, and the Googles and the Apples of the world are clearly moving in that direction to try to establish themselves as the go-to ways to bring your smartphone into the car. So the two, and we could get into some of this later, but the two main ones, Google and Apple, right? Apple has its CarPlay, Google has Android Auto, and what those are really car versions of their mobile operating systems. So you go in, you plug in your phone. For Google, and I'm not sure about Apple, for Google, you do it through USB because the connection needs to be so fast, it doesn't work through Bluetooth. But you plug in your phone goes dark. The screen, which had been your car screen, is basically taken over by the Google system, and it'll say, here's the apps you've got. You've got maps, you've got location, food, music. They're optimized in a way to make them easy to see, to make them simpler, to make the maps easier to read. It's also a chance for some of these companies to decide for themselves what's safe and what's not. So for example, Google has decided at this point, checking your Facebook status is not something you should be doing while driving. So those apps, if they're on your phone, are disabled in Android Auto, for example. Apple probably is making similar decisions. At the same time, they say, well, texting is okay. So we're going to open up the texting platform, but you can only do it through voice. So you can only respond and hear things through voice. We're not going to put a text message up on the screen. You're just going to hear it read back to you. That's basically where things are moving. And so you're going to have this ecosystem where the car is just another node in the network that's connected to everything else, and the data is flowing all around it. And the question is, what can we do about that? How much is going to be helpful versus how much is going to be potentially troubling and in need of regulatory?
Thanks, Aaron. Sure. That was really great, and I want to thank all of our panelists for laying out some issues that answer some questions and they probably raise a lot of questions too. So if you look around the room, you'll see that we have two microphones, one on this side and one on this side for people in the audience to get up and put questions to members of our panel. So while you're lining up behind the microphones, let me sort of kick it off if I can with the first question. So what's going to be the business model behind the connected car, or business models? Will this be a subscription sort of model? Will it be something that I as a consumer can opt into or opt out of? Will there be different models for different services or level of services? And who's going to pay the money and how's it going to be paid to whom? That's a lot of questions, I guess. But give me a quick answer.
I could start. First of all, it's always going to be opt-in. I think
always opt in.
Always opt in.
Okay.
Customers are going to have choices. Of course, if there's some regulatory requirement or whatever, that may override it. But we all will want to be very customer driven, and customers will want to have choices to participate. On business models, I think it's going to vary depending upon the type of service. Where we can create value that relates to our whole network of service and so on, those things will be part of the vehicle. Again, you can opt in, but we'll have models that are part of the ownership experience. Right. There may be other models or other services that are really going to be very consumer focused. Maybe it is the Wi-Fi hotspot and so on. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the car itself. It has to do with kind of an experience. And in that particular case, it would be on a subscription basis. So I think you're going to see multiple different models depending upon the service. But in the end, it's still always going to be customer choice.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? Liz?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be similar to the internet in that the two major models are you subscribe to something and you pay a monthly fee, or there's advertising.
Okay, one of those two, right?
Yeah. I think you're probably right. One of the interesting business challenges for the car companies is that traditionally they each had their own little system. And it was individualized. Ford had its thing, GM had its thing. As they move towards the Apples and the Google platforms, how are they going to differentiate themselves to a consumer? How is using Android Auto on a Ford going to be different than using it on a BMW? I think that's still yet to be sorted out, but it's something they're going to have to grapple with.
Just to give you a little bit of a flavor for how quickly this all has evolved, it was in 1985 at the Detroit Auto Show, which is the first year I went to the show, that was actually the first touchscreen that General Motors introduced on a car. It really didn't do too much, actually, but it was one of those green on black sort of basic things. Fast forward a decade later, or so, a little over a decade later, when OnStar came in, and I remember at that point the concierge service was really at the heart of OnStar. So you basically, push your OnStar button, you get a voice at the other end. And I remember right after OnStar came out, I wanted to test their ability to give you directions. So I said, could you give me the directions? I was in New Jersey. Could you give me the directions on how to get to 113 6th Avenue in Brooklyn? And there was a long pause at the other end of the OnStar line. And then the question came back, how do you spell Brooklyn? So it's come a long way since then. We have a question over here. Oh, sorry. At the microphone, and then we'll come back to you after that.
Hello? Okay.
Yep, you're on.
Great. Thank you so much for all of your talks this morning. I'm a librarian here at Stanford, and I'm really interested in all the things that you've mentioned about the data, the collection of data, the forward thinking about how you might use the data. But I would like to ask that you also think about how you preserve the data for researchers at institutions like Stanford, and how you might make it accessible to researchers that in a way that's affordable and accessible. So for one thing, I mean, it's great at Ford, you have all that data that you're collecting and you can use it in-house, but can researchers at institutions like Stanford or Duke or wherever, can they have access to that, and how will that happen, and what will be the models for that? So I'd just like to invite all of you here who are in the industry to think through that, and how long you might preserve it, so that researchers who might be looking into the history of these innovations might be able to use it in the future. And then, of course, the security issues are there, and trust issues are there, but you all have touched on that, and I appreciate that. But I'd just like to invite you to contemplate that and think about that and comment on it if you care to do so.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
I could start. You know, we have a well-stated view that the data that's collected in the vehicle, that's part of the vehicle, is owned by the customer. It's the customer's data. We are, as a company, we're stewards of that data. And I emphasized opt-in and so on. We want to be very, and I appreciate Liz's comment on being very transparent on what that data could be used for. We will work on opportunities to create value for customers with that data and present it to them. And if they are interested in that value, then they can opt in for that service. We're also, because there's data, some data will be anonymized so that it can be used for other purposes. Again, opt in but anonymized. But we're also committed to a time limit on that as well too, being very clear on how long we'll store that data. So I think there's very interesting questions around from being able to aggregate the data and use it for other services, or as you mentioned, from the library point of view and sources and research and so on. I think we've got a lot of questions to answer around being very centric around who owns that data and whether they want to contribute that in a way, in which way, anonymous way or whatever, to a bigger thing. And that, again, is going to still be up to the customer. So customer-centric.
I think you have a question over here at this table first, and then we'll go back to the microphones.
I do. I love voice. I want to tie what you started with and your career basically together. In 1991, you had these car enthusiast publications, and they could support the kind of research he does on car safety or, automobile-related behavior, and they published it based on the advertising, often classified advertising, and all that's fragmented, which is the problem with journalism today. So how are you addressing the challenge of doing investigative research of this type when you don't have the old revenue streams? I mean, where is your revenue stream coming from for this sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a larger question, I think, than even just auto coverage. The entire industry's grappling with that.
That's one that Jay got at in his opening remarks, but go ahead.
Yeah, how to maintain a robust news gathering operation where your traditional, almost standby source of easy cash is no longer there. I don't know that we have an answer to that. I mean, certainly auto companies, car dealers are kind of the bread and butter of a lot of local newspapers. As that starts to go away, it's really a question of what's going to replace them. I wish I had an answer. I just don't know.
Kind of related to both your questions. For organ donors, they have a similar problem. You get people to opt in because they think it's help them good. You might have people opt into the anonymized service to provide for research or to provide for,
Well, I will say, I mean, to piggyback off what Jim was talking about, the data collection, I think we could see a day where there's a little bit of distinction made between the infotainment diagnostic side and the safety side. In other words, we already collect data on fatal accidents, for example. Would it be permissible to get data on every accident that occurs and have that be put in some standardized, publicly accessible database that researchers, journalists, other people can access? I would certainly favor that, but those decisions are going to be made sometime in the next few years.
If I could just add to that, the one thing, and I agree with you on the potential opportunity, but the concern is that we're getting so sophisticated and connecting the dots with so much data, it really is hard to give one piece of data and say it's anonymized and so on, and not have somebody use five or six other pieces of data to fill in the missing blanks. That's the thing I personally am most concerned about is, and you've heard these stories on getting social security numbers and so on, just by having birth dates and where you grew or where you're born and so on. The potential is always there, and so I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's still a sensitivity around what is truly anonymized.
Well, we haven't even talked about it yet, but the idea of financial information. I mean, as we move towards connected cars, are we going to see this movement of Google Wallet and Apple Pay connect with the cars, so you can not only find things but maybe buy something as you're driving down the road, or reserve yourself a parking spot, or order some flowers for your wife on the way home? I mean. And then you're going to have a whole nother stream of potentially sensitive information that's floating out there.
We have another question. I'm sorry, but I don't want to cut you off. But we have a bunch of people lined up here, so let's go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So, as a guy who spent some of my high school years drag racing Fords versus Chevys, I can't help but ask this question. The automobile has long been associated in American culture with freedom, autonomy, even privacy. We can sort of get in the car, shut the door, and get out of town. And there's a sense of freedom, and that freedom is a large part of the automakers' marketing campaigns. And I wonder how much of that is going to go away if we are all potentially under surveillance by law enforcement, our insurance company, and whoever else is, for one reason or another, because of the legal or regulatory spheres, privy to some of that pervasive data. That's my question.
Liz, why don't you, why don't you take us?
I actually think that it isn't that different. I think it goes back to the idea that we've been talking about of opt-in. You opt in, and it's usually what these services are providing, even law enforcement and insurance, is they're trying to add value, and they're not trying to use it to raise your rates. They're really trying to help you get the best value out of their service, and they can be the most efficient.
I will say in the UK where I live, that user-based insurance seems to be further along than it is here, and all this sensor reporting of how much you drive and where you drive is obviously a big part of that. Let's go ahead to the.
I'm Malcolm Rankin. I work at trafficcommute.com, and I have a question for Liz. My company's trying to increase people's fuel mileages. I would like an app of some kind that would tell them how much money they're losing by braking.
Automatic, I think they're speaking later today. They're helping with fuel efficiency, and that's an aftermarket dongle. And they claim that they're saving people on average $500 a year on that stuff.
What's the alternative? Not braking?
If you manage space, you don't have to brake.
Okay.
So, but anyways.
Okay.
Might get a few honkers behind it.
Number two, this is for Aaron. When I'm talking to people saying you should drive a different way or whatever, they will say, oh, I drive very well. And then I go on the road and I start looking and I see people breaking the law, doing, tailgating, doing whatever they're doing. And I was wondering, is there some way that the information from the car could tell them how many times they have broken the law on a trip?
I'm sure the answer is yes. Well, I mean, you think of the trend now is, right, those Fitbits and all these, the connecting your body to the data of your body. You could basically do the same thing with a car. You can, if you wanted to, have it create an app that would tell you how many times you've sped, how many times you ran that red light, or any other kind of. You could look at fuel efficiency. You could look at braking habits. Any of that.
But the question is, I guess, if it's telling you how many times you broke the law.
Right, is it telling anybody
else? Somebody else, you see.
Yeah. That's the one thing. I would like people to realize.
You need like the Snapchat version of that.
It's like, I accidentally did this today. I will try not to do it tomorrow. But people tend to think I'm driving well, no accident, no problem. Yeah. So I was hoping maybe another app would be to people realize what they're doing and maybe make adjustments.
We've done a fair amount of research, and we refer to that category as coaching, right? And it can be very polarizing. Some folks, are very into wanting being coached and reminded all the time of the things they're not doing well and what they could do better. Others, it's like dieting. You can be. My wife is constantly telling me, I'm not eating right, I'm not exercising enough, and so on, and I get a little tired of it, right? So it can be very, very polarizing in finding the best way to coach. Technology-wise, not an issue. You mentioned automatic. Very familiar with the automatic folks and so on, and I've driven with automatic as well too. And when you pull up to the light and the light changes from yellow to red, and you hit the brake a little hard, you get that beep that reminds you you brake too hard. It does get annoying after a while. Or you take off from a light because you want to merge or so on, and you get the beep that tells you accelerated too fast. It can get annoying. So it's going to be up to individuals. But I think the important point is to understand the habits that you have. If you don't understand the kind of behaviors that contribute to poor fuel economy and so on, just understanding that. And once you understand that, then you'll be conscious of it, and you don't need constant reminders that you're hitting the accelerator.
This is a fascinating thing too, where the auto companies now, even the alerts you're going to get. There's a whole study of what the best alerts are for different things, because you don't want it to be too annoying.
Right.
Where you just say the hell with it, either ignore it or you shut it off. So is a vibration better? Is a slight ring? Is a light? All these kinds of things that are still being sorted out.
We have another question here, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Vicki Chipkowitz. I have a question, two questions. One is, you'd mentioned the Corvair driving, security policy, and litigation. And I'm just wondering, in the big picture, who's going to indemnify the connected car apps? Is it going to be the car companies? Is there any kind of insight that you have into that? And the second question I have is ownership of the customer. So for the car companies, like Ford, is it an issue that a third party would come in with their platform into the car and connect it in and get that data on the customers? And is there something going on in the back end where that data is being shared with the car companies?
Which question you want to take first?
Well,
I can take the second question first.
Okay, take the second question. Sure,
Clearly, we as car companies want to maintain ownership of the customer, especially when it comes to service of their vehicle. The last thing we want is a third party routing vehicles to, competitors or other service outlets and so on. So we want to maintain that control of the customer. Also, the experience is always going to be tied back to the vehicle they're in, and so we want to make sure that the experience is a good one. And if we hand that off to somebody else and they're more concerned about some other kind of experience that's annoying, it's going to be a reflection on us. And so these are really good questions. So in the environment with Google and Android for the car and CarPlay and so on, how is that going to affect it? We're paying very, very particular attention to that. As consumers say they want these things, they want CarPlay in the car, we have to be driven to offer that. But we have to make sure, though, that we can maintain ownership of them as a customer as well. So we're still working on it, and we'll see as we roll these things out.
We're running into the last 5 minutes, so let me just get a quick answer on that liability thing. Anybody want to take an answer on who's going to be? You
raised an excellent question. I mean, look, we have cars right now on the road that are supposed to automatically brake in emergency, right? So if that doesn't happen, who's responsible? I really don't know the answer to that.
That's forward-looking adaptive radar, exactly.
Right, as we have the GM's going to have its Super Cruise and the other equivalents where pretty soon in the next few years, your car's going to be able to go on the highway, you take your hands off the steering wheel and your foot off the pedal, and it just goes, and it steers. And so if that system fails, I don't know. It's a very good question. We should get a lawyer to answer.
Well, I'm just happy that the best answer I can give you is I'm just happy that I have two sons who are attorneys, okay? Next, please.
This sort of relates to the last question, but you had mentioned before that one of the key principles that the car companies, or at least Ford is using, is that the customer owns the data. One question that occurs to me is, does it follow that the customer should have access to all of that data if they want it? And I think of two ways that comes up. One is, well, I just want to play with it, which I think is a more edge case for the general American consumer. But the other thing is, like, I'm actually not sure how it works right now. If I want to go to a third-party repair shop and they're going to hook me up to the diagnostic machine, do they currently have to pay Ford for some kind of interpretive package to interpret that data, and how would that work going forward? Should I, as the customer, be able to decide that, well, I want to take this to whatever repair shop I want to, therefore that format should be open in some way?
Well, the service requirements are regulated, and so the access for the OBD2 connector to diagnostic information is required by law. So it allows for independent services to repair vehicles and so on. Your question in terms of consumer access to the data, we're still thinking about exactly how that works and so on. Again, we think it is, like I said, the consumer's data, but to give them access, what does that actually mean? Because some of it, could create some, a whole set of tools to really understand the data that you're getting. I think in terms of getting access to data and being able to use it, there are some really interesting questions around liabilities too, right? So if we give you access to data and you modify the vehicle in such a way that it creates harm or something like that, how do we deal with that liability?
Are you lined up for questions here, or yes? Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you. You weren't standing close to the mic, so I didn't know.
Yes, sir. Thank you. John Lackness. I'm a data science, security, and privacy consultant to, among others, the Department of Transportation Connected Vehicle Program. So one thing I can kind of assure the crowd is that the bureaucrats are very concerned about everybody's safety and even privacy, right? We actually take that very seriously. But the one thing we don't really have control of as much, at least from the Department of Transportation and NHTSA standpoint, is actually this insurance issue. And specifically, you're talking about this kind of opt-in model. None of you mentioned much about insurance in your expositions, but we talked about it very briefly, but saying that this opt-in model would happen. But I mean, let's face it, this is a legally required thing to have, and essentially the rates could go up if you are not participating. And second of all, there's also this kind of requirement almost. You could almost say that we need to have that data in the sense of like when you take this black box out of the vehicle and there's been an accident in order to determine fault. And so essentially, basically, all of your data will go to the insurers at some point. The question I really have is who is what is the organization or that is actually kind of like reining in these the data use regulations with regard to the insurance, because essentially you could use any kind of data and all data, and they will use all data, including what songs you listen to and everything, because in the world of big data we have this semantic understanding about maybe if you listen to a certain type of music you have bad driving habits or something like that. So if whoever is the expert on the panel could please
Liz, do you want to take a crack at that one?
So the question is...
We're running out of time here, so be...
Yeah, like, what's going to happen if your insurance company gets access to the data, and what are the implications of that?
It's not what I mean, I know what's going to happen if they get access to it, and I know that they want access to it, and I know that they probably will have access to it in the sense of like, they're going to get your black box. The question is, what are the... what is the official body or the official position of Ford or whatnot of how this data is going to be controlled in a way that I guess
I don't know about a official position. I think that it does go back to creating value. We all make trade-offs all the time. We may pay more money for something because it represents value to us. And your decision on paying more for something versus mine is your assessment of value. And I think when it comes to insurance, it's that way too. If the insurance company promises me great value if I give this information to them, I'm the one that's going to determine to give the information. If I'm saying, I think an earlier gentleman talked about drag racing and so on, hey, maybe he wants to, pay the higher rates and not give the information because he wants that freedom. So I think in the end, hopefully, I think we'll be driven by what is value. And it's not something that's regulated and forced on people and forced to tell them what good value is. They'll have to have that decision themselves.
Well, at the same time, I think your question illustrates that really, at the moment, there aren't any rules for that. And at some point, there might need to be a legislative or regulatory approach that sets some parameters for what's considered acceptable. Right now, there just isn't anything. And so is it going to come down to each automaker individually, a broader scope?
So I am really sorry that we're out of time, and I apologize to those of you who are at the microphones. We're going to have time later on in the conference, I believe, Jay, for a lot of individual interaction and some more questions.
One yes or no question?
Sure.
Yes or no, is there currently a program like PRISM for Ford to provide user data to U.S. intelligence agencies?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. That was good.